This morning, we're going to talk about something that this kind of ventures into an area that is one of those things that keeps me up at night. There's a lot of things that keep me up at night, unfortunately, but this is, like, as a pastor, this is one of those things that just weighs heavily on my heart, and largely it has to do with the reality that in my line of work and in my life, there are a number of people that oftentimes will enter into the space, and many of those people I will come to know their names, maybe even something, a little bit of their story, and then at some time later on, they're no longer there. We understand that when it comes to things like the church, to this Christian life that many of us are pursuing with our own lives, that there are some that maybe kind of start this journey or have some form of starting this journey, but that ultimately don't make it to the end. And I can just tell you that as a pastor, that weighs heavy. The very possibility that somebody might come into a place where I have some measure of influence and perhaps some measure of responsibility, and the feeling of and the weight of, even though I know that the souls of people are not ultimately my responsibility, I am not the savior of anybody, I'm not smart enough, I am not wise enough, I am not talented enough to carry the weight of any of those things, and yet I think you could probably understand and even empathize from your own experiences, the kinds of things that you have responsibility for, and when those things don't quite work out in the way that you had hoped, it's difficult. It's a burden that we bear, and it just so happens that for me, that so much revolves around the lives of people. And this morning we sang this song, that third song we sang, and it has this lyric in it where we express, God, I want to be close to your heart, loving the world and hating the dark. And what I believe the author meant in penning those words, and hopefully what we mean as we're singing those words, is that we are on this path of wanting to become more like Jesus, right? That we understand there's a gap, an infinite gap between the condition of my heart and the heart of my God, the heart of Jesus. And part of what living the Christian life is this pursuit of finding my heart becoming more like the heart of God, more like the heart of this Jesus whom I'm serving. And so, Lord, I want to be near to your heart, right? That's really what we shared in the song. And in that, there's this understanding of how God loves the world. So, God, as you love the world, so help me to love the world also. But then on the other side of that, the lyric says, hating the dark. And that's this recognition of the reality that in this world there is darkness. There are dark places. There are dark forces. And part of the challenge of being a Christian, part of the challenge of walking with Jesus, I think, is living in this sort of in-between space of understanding that as a follower of Jesus, I am called to a life that fully embraces the kingdom of Jesus with all of the ways in which Jesus rules and reigns in that kingdom. And yet, in reality, I find myself in a world, in this physical, material world, walking along with physical, material people. And in that world, I am called to love the people that I encounter in that world. And in that world, I am called to despise the darkness, and the darkness that still has a hold and a grip of so many. And sometimes navigating the tension of those competing realities of loving the world and yet hating something about the world, it's a challenge, it's a difficulty. And it is also, I think, a space where we find some losing their way to a degree that they ultimately don't persevere in their faith to the very end. If you have your Bibles, I'm going to ask you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Paul is closing out a long argument or conversation that he is having with this church by virtue of their correspondence to him and now his correspondence back to them, primarily regarding this question of whether or not it was appropriate for the Corinthian believers, these church members, to continue to participate in this other sphere that was very familiar to them, that they found reasons for why it was okay and permissible for them to continue to participate in these things that were happening in the world, in the ordinary course of the world. But Paul takes issue with them, and I think it's instructive to us regarding the various spaces that we can either participate in ourselves or perhaps choose to abstain from, or how we should just simply understand how the various things in the world are competing for an opportunity to form us and to make us into something that we are becoming. I'll come back to this, but let me just say that at this present moment and at every moment of our lives, we're being formed. We are. We are in a process of formation. And so one of the disciplines of the church is this discipline of spiritual formation. And so you might find that in a church that has a number of staff members, there may be a person who is assigned with the responsibility of overseeing the area of spiritual formation. That is, how are our congregants, how is our church community being formed spiritually? We are being formed spiritually, corporately as a group of people. We are being formed spiritually as individuals based upon how we may or may not participate in various spiritual practices and disciplines. But spiritual formation is not the only kind of formation that occurs in our lives. There are other ways in which we are also being formed, right? And I think it's no surprise to us that as a child is grown and becoming more aware of the world in which they live and are exploring and asking questions and getting answers to those questions as they are interacting with other children of their age or younger or older, as they're interacting with adolescents and with adults. All of those things together are having an influence on how that person is being formed. You and I, whether we are in the company of another person or several people, the conversations that are happening in those spaces are forming us. If I find myself alone sitting on a couch watching a television program or a sporting event, I am being formed. If I am holding my phone or my iPad in my hands and scrolling from screen to screen, interacting with the various things that I am consuming through that process, I'm being formed. And so formation is happening all the time. And Paul has a concern regarding the potential for a malformation, a bad kind of formation that may be possibly occurring within the lives of those who are supposed to be being formed more into the image of Jesus. So 1 Corinthians chapter 10, let me read a few verses here. Paul says, "Now, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors," now Paul here now points back to this group of people he describes as ancestors, and for him they were literally, from an ethnical point of view, his ancestors. He was a Jewish man, and so he had a heritage that pointed back to the particular people that he is talking about, but he's also recognizing that the church in Corinth, which would largely have been comprised with non-Jewish people, that they are related by spiritual association also to this group of ancestors, the nation of Israel. And so Paul says our ancestors were all, and he says some peculiar things about their experiences. He says they were all under the cloud, all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them, since they were struck down in the wilderness. Now, if you are familiar with the narrative of the early beginnings of the nation of Israel that we read in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, some of those allusions that Paul is pointing to will sound familiar. You're immediately picking up on what those things mean. If you're not familiar with those things, let me tell you, first of all, as a reminder, Paul says we need to be aware of what is the significance and the meaning of these things. He says, brothers and sisters, I don't want you to be unaware of the importance of what lessons we can learn from the nation of Israel. And then he, in describing their experiences, uses repetitiously this word all. Listen again, he says they were all under the cloud. They all passed through the sea. They all were baptized into Moses. They all ate the same spiritual food. They all drank the same spiritual drink. And then we come to the end of it, and Paul says, but God was not pleased with most of them, seeing that they perished in the wilderness. What does that mean? What is the lesson that Paul is trying to introduce to us? And Paul is sort of setting this up for the rest of this conversation, and that is that when it came to the nation of Israel, in particular, those who were rescued out of the land of Egypt from their bondage and slavery there, with the promise that God would bring them into a new land where they could experience the bounty and the blessings of God, these people had these incredible spiritual advantages, and despite those advantages, some of them failed to endure to the end. That's the point that Paul's making. Despite the fact that this group of people, that they all were under the cloud, that they all passed through the sea, that they all ate the same food, that they all drank the same drink, most of them perished in the wilderness. Despite their incredible spiritual advantages, some failed to endure to the end. In other words, despite the fact that this group of people witnessed themselves the work, the miraculous providence of God as it miraculously rescued them from Egypt, as it miraculously traversed them across the Red Sea, as it miraculously provided for them in the wilderness, food that appeared out of nowhere every single day for them to eat and to be nourished by, drink that flowed mysteriously and miraculously from a rock. Despite having experienced the very presence of God leading and guiding them by a cloud during the day and by fire at night, most of them, God was not pleased with them, and they perished in the wilderness. Today we struggle, I think, sometimes with a similar challenge of having been afforded certain kinds of opportunities or spiritual privileges or advantages as people that have been given something like the Word of God to guide and to direct our lives, that have been given something like the church for us to find community and brotherhood and sisterhood, family with people that are not our biological families. We've been given the privilege of experiencing the presence of God when we gather together in a place like this. We sang the song, Jesus is here, and so the ground upon which I stand is holy. There's something beautiful and profound and mysterious and godly when the church gathers together. We have the particular advantage, even in our private time, to go before God and to pray and to know that our prayers are not simply bouncing off of a ceiling, but they are ascending into heaven and they are being heard in the ears of God. And yet, despite these particular advantages and experiences that are afforded to us as we are following Jesus, the reality is there is also the possibility that we will not continue on with it to the end. In the same way that Israel, much of Israel, was unable to persevere to the end, that is, entering into the promised land. And again, this is where my heart is often just weighed with such heaviness as I think about those who have walked away, those who have given up, those who have petered off. One of the things that I think we need to caution ourselves against is something I might describe as the religion of association. Now, we know that it is quite possible in our context for people to participate in at least a minimally religious way in the various elements of Christian life and practice. And for many, there is this feeling, there's this sentiment that by participating, even at a minimal level, that is going to garner me favor with God, who is then going to be obliged to overlook my other inevitable faults. I think about many of the conversations I have with people. This happens all the time in conversations I have as people are interested in what I do for a living and then maybe start to think back on their own particular religious or spiritual past, many of which they've been disconnected from for many years. Let me just use an example of a person who grew up in the Catholic Church, let's say. And some of you will identify with this. And they have long abandoned the weekly and regular practices that devout Catholics might follow, but it doesn't change the memories that they have of having grown up in some of those places. And they have a kind of association with this past, with this heritage, with this way in which they identify themselves, that for all practical purposes, they still see themselves as Catholics. So maybe I don't go to Mass every week. Maybe it's been a long time since I've gone to confession. Maybe it's been a minute since I last participated in the Eucharist, but I'm still Catholic, and God knows my heart, and so therefore I have this expectation that by virtue of my association, I haven't denounced or renounced my Catholicism. I haven't denounced or renounced my relationship with Jesus Christ as a Christian. And so because I haven't done any of those things, I am essentially by default still associated with those various places. And so I suspect God will understand and overlook my inevitable faults, right? That's the danger of association kind of religion. We also need to beware the religion of the good. And this is another conversation I may have with people that maybe have little to no experience with any kind of formal religious society or community. And there is, for those that are maybe not quite at the point where they would outright reject the acknowledgement of God as a real being. That is, they wouldn't describe themselves as an atheist. They would at least come to the place where they recognize that there is something beyond this. There is something beyond us. And I don't know if it's a something or a someone or someone's, but something, some or other is out there. And my understanding is that my responsibility is to be good. Right? And so I subscribe to the religion of the good. And so long as I am seeking to be a good person, however I might or however other people might define that, which of course is another interesting conversation. But that commitment to being good, then that frees me up to otherwise pursue the life that I want to pursue, to live my life however I want to please, or that pleases me. Now, the subject that really kind of serves as the matter in particular that Paul is dealing with in the Corinthian church is probably some kind of ongoing participation in idolatrous practices. So we have to imagine, again, Paul goes into the city of Corinth, right? And there's no Christians there. Christianity is like, it's a fledgling movement at the point in which Paul comes into Corinth. Like this is a place that is still essentially steeped and governed by the Greco-Roman culture that has occupied that space for hundreds of years. And so all of the life of the inhabitants of that community were governed and regulated by that culture. And here Paul comes in with a brand new story. And that story is Jesus, crucified on the cross in Jerusalem, has risen from the dead, and he is Lord of all. Right? That's the message that Paul brings into the city of Corinth. And so from that, there is birthed something like a movement. That is, a person or a handful of people embrace the message of the gospel. And they yield their lives to Jesus. They accept Jesus as their Savior, and they embrace him as their Lord. And then more people do that. And pretty soon, all of a sudden, you have something that looks like a church. But that doesn't ultimately eradicate the very real and present way that the community at large was continuing to go on with its life, right? Like Corinth was still Corinth. Now you read about the background of Corinth and you'll find some pretty incredibly ungodly ways in which life was characterized and defined by Corinthian people. That didn't change for the large majority of people. And so now you have Christianity as a kind of subculture within a larger culture. And what seems to be at issue here is for those that were embracing Jesus as Lord, that were forming this thing called a church, and now we're being formed into the heart and the life of Jesus, the one that they were professing to follow, there seemed to be this allure of the old that continued to have their attention. And that shouldn't really come as much of a surprise to us, right? I mean, just imagine if you grew up in Corinth, if you grew up with a way of being, with a way of living, with a way of doing that also involved like every matter and aspect of your life. Imagine if, and we largely think about our holidays as being largely religiously neutral, right? When you think about it, just like go through your calendar, look at the various holidays, and you'll see that many of the holidays that we celebrate are religiously neutral. And the ones that have religious significance, like Easter, like Christmas, we have largely neutralized the spiritual realities of those outside of the church, right? Like, did you know that not only Christian people celebrate Easter? Oh, you didn't know that? All right, well, I'll just invite you to walk into Walmart, right? And the first 3, 4, 5 aisles that you encounter are going to demonstrate for you how the world celebrates Easter, right? Yeah. So we have largely neutralized what spiritual holidays there are, and otherwise, those holidays are not necessarily spiritual in their origins, and yet there's a way of being, there's a kind of community and camaraderie that we feel, right? Every 4th of July, for instance. How many of you light off fireworks on the 4th of July? Is that legal? I'm sorry, is that legal? I forget. Are we allowed to do that in Maine? We are. Okay. I know you can't do that everywhere. So some of you light off fireworks, right? Because you're nut jobs, and that's fine, right? No, but we have barbecues. We have get-togethers, right? There's a way that we share something in that. It brings us together. It binds us, and like that's all beautiful. That's all wonderful. And so, when it came to Corinth, though, now when you're talking about their holidays, these were largely holy days for the Corinthians. The problem is they were holy days in the names of various pagan gods and deities. So now, as a Christian, you have yourself this dilemma of, I'm a Christian. I am following Jesus, the one real, true God, and yet the larger part of my before Jesus world is still embracing these false gods. And the celebrations and the festivals and the feasts they all revolve around the celebration of those false gods. So what do I do? Am I permitted to participate in those things, or am I forbidden from participating in those things? And now, just to kind of bring the point a step further, imagine if within the context of your family, you were the only person that became a Christian. You were it. And so your siblings, your parents, your children, if you have any of those things, aunts, uncles, whatever, none of them are Christians. And so tomorrow, when the feast is happening and everybody has the day off and everybody is at the temple attending the feast, except for you, what do you like? Are you, as a Christian, are you permitted to go and participate in that feast, or is it something that you should abstain from? That's a hard question, right? It's hard and it isn't hard, but you can imagine how difficult it would be to deal with that as a person who is both a Christian and also part of the larger community. Now, the Corinthian church, in their defense to Paul, made some good points. One of the points they would have made was, hey, Paul, we know that there are no gods but the one true God. And so if we decide to put ourselves that is in the place where the false gods are being worshipped, then, well, it doesn't mean anything because we know they are false gods. And so we can't be guilty of any wrongdoing. Can you see the logic behind the argument? Like, I know that when I go to that festival where everybody is worshiping this false god, I know that that's not a real God. And so, therefore, it's really, it's a neutral matter for me, right? That would have been one of the arguments they made. Another argument that they would have made was, Paul, listen, we know there are no gods but the one true God, and we know that the food that we decide to eat or not to eat, that is a morally neutral question, right? God doesn't care if we decide to eat meat or not eat meat, like even to the point where if meat happened to be sacrificed to idols, God does not care whether we eat the meat or we don't eat the meat. That's just kind of a matter of conscience. So if we go and we eat at the feast where some of the food has been sacrificed to idols or is associated with the worship of these idols, then we don't have to worry about ourselves as having done anything wrong, because we're participating in the event per se, but we're not really participating in the worship aspect of the event. Okay, so are you with me? Like that's the thinking, I think, that they would have brought to this argument. And so what they, I think, are pointing out and why Paul uses the examples he's used is they're saying, Paul, we know, clearly we are members in good standing with the real church of Jesus. And so therefore, when we decide to go to this feast, we don't have to worry about being in any spiritual danger. Like, we don't have to worry about those feasts having a spiritually negative effect on us. That's the conclusion that they had come to. And Paul, he agrees with their arguments. You're right. There are no gods but the one true God. You're right. God doesn't care what you decide to eat. But Paul does come into disagreement with them at the point where their participation in this particular arena, where they would say it has no negative effect on us, Paul would say, oh, but it does. But it will. Paul says in verse 6, now these things, again pointing back to the examples that we have from the nation of Israel, he says these things took place as examples for us so that we will not desire evil things as they did. Don't become idolaters as some of them were. Paul here is warning of the possibility that our desires can be drawn away by evil things. That seems to be what is so on Paul's mind, or what so has Paul concerned with the spiritual well-being of the church in Corinth, is how their desires might be drawn away by evil things. He said, these things were given as examples for us so that we will not desire evil things as they did. And then adds to that the admonition, don't become idolaters as they did. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is drawing on our desires? Paul might have asked something like, hey, what is it about these feasts held in the honor of the gods that continues to draw you in? What is the allure? What is the shine? What is so attractive about them that you're still feeling yourself drawn back into the celebrations that you once participated in by default, but now as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, I imagine that your desires should be changing in such a way that you would describe that experience of what you had once been willing to do is something that you did before you knew Christ, but now it just isn't for you anymore. Right? And so Paul is now, he's bringing into question what's going on with our desires. And then I think the second question, the follow-up to that is, what are we being formed into? He says, don't become idolaters. Paul here seems to be suggesting that there is this logical sequence in which the desires that we allow to be cultivated and groomed within our lives, they eventually mature and blossom into something that forms us into what we will become. If you allow your desires to be drawn into idolatrous practices, Paul seems to be suggesting that the logical end to those desires is you're going to become an idolater. And so he says both things. He says, don't let your heart desire evil things, and don't become an idolater. Our desires, which become our actions, become our formation. The 7 Habits gurus say we become what we repeatedly do, right? James, he describes the process this way. In James chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, he says, "But each person is tempted when he is drawn away and enticed by his own evil desire." And then listen to how the process works. After desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. And what James here is describing in this process of how our desires conceive and give birth to this sin, right? That is, our desires become our actions, and that ultimately leads to death. That becomes what we are formed into, not the life-filled beings that God has in mind for us, but instead beings that have died. And that is set in opposition. Like if you read the rest of what James has to say, that little snippet is set in opposition to how God is the originator of every good and every perfect gift that comes into our lives. That is, God is not the one who is standing in the way of our joy and our peace, of our ability to experience things like pleasure and happiness. God's not the gatekeeper for our happiness. No, God is the true source and origin of our happiness. God gave us desire. He's not opposed to our having desire. He gave us desire. We're the ones that have perverted those desires. God isn't against our pleasure. He's the one that gave us the gift of pleasure. We're the ones that chose to make pleasure our God in the place of the one true God. And so then Paul, he goes into these various examples of how the nation of Israel reneged on its pledge to follow God and how their choices destroyed so many of them. That's ultimately what it came down to, their unwillingness to remain faithful to the pledge that they had made to serve and to follow God with all their hearts ultimately led to their own destruction. And Paul urges the church now to pay attention to that example of how others fail to stay faithful to the end, because he recognizes the possibility that the same can be true of us. There exists the possibility that we will fail to persevere to the end. You don't believe me? Just look around. It's happening all the time. It may be at this very present moment for all of us that are here in this room a more close reality than it is for others. You may be here this morning and spiritually speaking, like on the brink of walking away, on the brink of giving up, on the brink of this is just not the direction that I want to pursue with my life anymore. The reason why that happens is because so often our unwillingness to pull ourselves away from those things that are competing for our heart's desires, the desires that belong to God. Like my desires, all of them, they belong to him. And yet, sometimes I let the elements of this world creep in and attach themselves to my heart and to my person. And those things, they start to draw me away. They start to pull me away. The wisdom that Paul begs the church to listen to in verse 12, he says, "So whoever thinks he stands must be careful not to fall." Here, it seems that Paul is pointing out that this church that, as we have come to know over the past several months, they were very proud of themselves. They were very proud of what they had become. They were very proud of their kind of spirituality. They were very proud of their kind of Christianity. And yet Paul here cautions them. You who think you stand, you who think you're on solid ground, you who think there's nothing out there that could ever possibly deteriorate your faith, you that think you can go from place to place and not have to worry about being formed by the various influences outside in the world, be careful, you who stand. Be careful that you do not fall. Verse 13, he says, no temptation has come upon you except what is common to humanity, but God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you were able, but will, with the temptation, provide the way out so that you may be able to bear it. Here, Paul describes the reality that all of us as Christians continue to face day after day after day, moment by moment, various temptations and trials. And in those temptations and trials, we have a promise declared over us, and that is, number one, God will not allow us to be tempted or tested beyond our capacity to bear up under it. That is, there is nothing that is going to come into your life that you are not going to be able to withstand. That's the promise that God has made for you. Secondly, the promise is that God will always provide a way of escape. There is no temptation, there is no trial, there's nothing that we can honestly say, well, that's too much for me, because God will provide a way of escape. That's the promise. But that's a sort of parenthesis in this conversation regarding the Corinthian church's willingness to remain in these idolatrous spaces. He says, of course, when it comes to the ordinary kinds of temptation that you and I experience as believers, God is going to help us. We have divine aid. Listen, if you're here today struggling with something or another, the good news is God stands at the ready to help. He's going to help through the ordinary trials. He's going to help through the ordinary temptations that we face. The temptations and trials that we may be facing as individuals will vary from person to person. But they are not exceptional. In other words, they are not to a degree that we are not able to bear up under them. As hard as some of them may seem to be, it is not impossible to find victory over them when we have God helping us. Again, that's the good news. This is one way that we understand our fallenness as people, our imperfectness as people, and our need for God's help to overcome. And the fact that we struggle, how many of you struggle? The fact that you struggle, the fact that I struggle, the fact that we fall from time to time, how many of you fall from time to time? That's right, this is just a good, let's just get it out there kind of session. All right? So, some of you struggle. And then fewer of you fall from time to time, right? Based on what I just witnessed. The fact that we struggle and even fall from time to time is not what Paul's warning us about. Like, Paul's not saying, hey, don't you dare screw up. Don't you dare give into that thing again. Or else, you better know, he's ready, fists up, ready to take you on if you fail, if you fall. No, Paul recognizes the struggle, says, God, in our struggles and in our fallenness, God stands as a helper to come alongside us and to hold us up and to give us strength. And when we fall, to pick us up again. The fact that there is a struggle at all is a good thing. You know what it means if you have a struggle? What that means is that you have two things going on at the same time. One is you have these desires that are pulling you away from God, and those are living in conflict with what God is doing in you. Right? If you're a follower of Jesus, God's doing a work in you. He's working in you. He's working in you right now. He's working in you all the time. You know that person in your life that's really obnoxious? Some of you live with that person. Some of you go to work and work alongside that person. That's probably God working on you, right? So he's working on us, but listen, at the same time that God is working on us, we have these desires that are pulling us away. That's the struggle. And the struggle is real, am I right? So the struggle is an indication that there's something good that's going on there. That's not what Paul's warning about. What Paul is warning us against is a different posture toward one's sin. It is a willingness to put God to the test. That's the difference. You see, when it came to the nation of Israel, God was not a God who was incapable of understanding how hard it was for people whose only lives were defined by the slavery from which they came. God was not able, it's not that God was unable to understand and to appreciate the difficulty that the nation of Israel faced as they walked through these different challenges. God does not lack understanding when it comes to where you're weak, to where I'm weak. That is an altogether different thing from a person's willingness to test God. I'm going to put God to the test. For the Corinthian church members, it was about a false kind of security that was based on their religious excellence. Like, look how excellent we are, religiously speaking. Their participation in the church's life and practice, it gave them this false sense of assurance that their continued participation in the world's practices was a morally neutral matter. Look at, I am religious by association, or I subscribe to the religious of the good, and so with that, I am now free to do whatever I please. But Paul describes their practice as premeditated, as willful and deliberate. And what he says of that is that kind of posture towards sin leads to destruction in the same way it happened in the examples that Paul has already given to us. Paul says, God stands at the ready to help us in our struggles. But if you, by virtue of your will and determination and deliberation, are going to try to test the grace and the mercy and the kindness of God, don't expect to find God's help in that place. Why would we? How crazy is that? How crazy is it for me to expect that I can willfully and deliberately live my life in opposition to what is good, what is godly, what is holy, and at the same time, God will He'll just overlook it. He'll be there to help when I decide I'm ready to receive his help. Instead, verse 14 gives us the antidote to that kind and their kind of posture. He says, so then, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. Flee from idolatry. Get out. Run. Get away. This church seemed to think that their Christian participation canceled out what else they may have been willing to participate in, like it vaccinated them somehow. And I fear for those who feel like their periodic attendance at a church service, or their periodic gift in an offering, or their periodic good work or smattering of good works here and there is a kind of vaccination against how we are truly accountable for our whole lives before God. I fear for those who think that they are able to consume any kind of thing that they so choose, or they can allow their desires to ultimately lead them into any place without any fear that those things are going to have a material effect on them, that it's going to control them. The reality is we live in a world with all of these kingdoms that are trying to fight their way in and take hold of and control of our desires. Think of the money that is spent in the kingdom of entertainment. The hundreds of billions of dollars globally spent worldwide every single year to put something before our eyes that we will consume, that will attract and allure and draw us in. And so many of those things, like we talk about all the time, they are not in and of themselves evil or wrong. But we have to be careful about pretending that our participation in those various arenas don't have a forming effect on our lives. We have grown up in a land of relative wealth and prosperity, where we are taught things like the American dream and a way of living that we should all aspire to, or that we can all have if we're willing to do certain things and embrace a certain understanding of how the world works. And for many of us, we have made commitments to the allurements of wealth and prosperity without also understanding how that wealth and prosperity has had a forming effect on us, how the material things of this world have got their tentacles all wrapped around us, and they are making us into something, and quite possibly something that isn't exactly like Christ. There's the kingdom of social media. And again, when I find myself with my eyes in front of a screen consuming whatever content I may happen to be engaging, whether it's for work or for pleasure, to pretend that my interaction with such devices is not going to have a forming effect on my person and on my spirituality, that is just delusional. The kingdom of comfort and leisure is selling an attractive option for us to pursue. How can we increase the degree of pleasure that we're experiencing in this world? How can we more enter into into spaces where our lives are about the kind of leisure we can afford? Again, not that things like rest and play and leisure are in and of themselves evil things. No, they're beautiful things. They're things that God has gifted to us and that he wants us to embrace and enjoy. But to pretend that engaging in those things and expecting that they're not going to have any kind of formational effect on us is just delusional. And so I close with Paul's encouragement to us, where we take all of this and kind of boil it down into a matter of how we go about our lives and all of the various choices that we have to make and all of the various possibilities that are in front of us for how we spend our time, how we spend our money, how we exist in relationships with other people, what we commit ourselves to. Paul says, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do everything for the glory of God. What a great objective for me to start to bring everything in my life into the realm where it brings honor and glory